Hello and welcome to MEE Live. My name is Matilda Mallinson.
And I'm Tamara Hemani. It's Thursday, the 18th of December, and our final show of 2025.
So naturally, today we reflect. Was 2025 really the dawn of a new Middle East? Things rarely stand still in the Middle East, and 2025 was no exception.
On taking office in January, US President Donald Trump immediately declared a ceasefire in Gaza after 15 months of war.
Israel and the US began to plan out Gaza's future without Palestinians.
Trump pledged to turn the Strip into a Riviera, the Boston consulting group and Tony Blair got involved, and European and Arab states raced to offer an alternative. Then, on the 18th of March, Israel violently resumed its blockade and bombardment of the Strip.
The bloodshed did not stop there. In Syria, where rebel forces led by Ahmed al-Sharaa had overthrown the country's former president Bashar al-Assad, an attempted insurgency by Assad loyalists spiraled into massacres of Alawite communities, leaving over 1,400 people dead.
The killings were the first major outbreak of violence in the country following a relatively bloodless revolution the previous December. They highlighted the deep sectarian mistrust that Assad's rule had left in its wake.
As shocking scenes emerged from Gaza and Syria, the US was conducting an immense bombing campaign of its own against Houthi targets in Yemen, coordinated largely in emojis on Signal. 1,000 strikes, and 2 months later, Trump declared a ceasefire, although Houthis continued striking targets in Israel and the Red Sea to protest the genocide in Gaza.
That same month, the US president would spend his first trip abroad in the Gulf, where he visited Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Declaring America's past of nation building firmly behind it, Trump closed a series of investment deals with Gulf leaders and approved their request to lift sanctions on Syria, which were first imposed to punish Assad for crimes against the Syrian people.
Notably absent from the tour was talk of Gaza, where Israel's blockade of food and aid was soon to result in a formal declaration of famine.
In May, the US and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began food distributions which would later be described as death traps. Under the new GHF system, over 2,000 Palestinian aid seekers were massacred and scores more displaced to the south, while famine prevailed across the Strip.
But by June, attention shifted as Israel launched overnight attacks on Iran in an unsuccessful bid to destroy its nuclear capacity. This began a 12-day war between the two countries. The US joined in, striking multiple Iranian nuclear facilities before Trump forced an end to the war just days later.
The decision exposed a growing rift within Trump's MAGA base over America's involvement in foreign wars. And though Trump claimed he'd restored peace to the region, July brought Syria more sectarian violence. Clashes between government forces and Druze militias in the country's south escalated into large-scale ethnic massacres and mass displacement.
Amid the chaos, Israel struck government buildings in Syria's capital, Damascus, ramping up its aggressive stance towards the country's interim president. At the same time, Israel's government approved one of the deadliest operations of its genocide so far and invaded Gaza City.
But it was not until September, when Israel struck Hamas's leadership during ceasefire negotiations in the Qatari capital of Doha, that the US took action. On the 9th of October, Trump declared a new ceasefire in Gaza, saying that Israel's military would withdraw from the Strip and an international stabilization force would control it instead, governed by a Trump-appointed board of peace.
Global attention shifted to Sudan 2.5 years into a catastrophic civil war where the paramilitary rapid support forces had seized the city of al-Fasher, massacring at least 60,000 civilians in the process. By early December, the group, which is charged with genocide, said it had taken control of the West Kordofan state, an immense shift in the course of the war after the Sudanese army reclaimed the capital in March.
But trouble remains in Gaza too. Since Trump's ceasefire, Israel's military has killed nearly 400 Palestinians, including most recently Hamas's deputy military leader, and continues to occupy half of the Strip. Israel has also rebutted Syria's bids for a truce and refused to withdraw its military from the occupied south, where ongoing raids on Syrian villages are causing rising anger and fear among local residents.
And in neighbouring Lebanon, the deadline for Hezbollah to disarm by the end of the year is rapidly approaching, but the group has refused, just as Israel has breached the terms of the ceasefire over 10,000 times. This year, Trump declared a historic new dawn for the Middle East, but with Israel warring nations on multiple fronts and the region still scarred by proxy violence and sectarianism, was he right? We turn first to Syria, arguably the region's biggest transformation of 2025.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Good morning, I'm Victor Blackwell.
Good to be with you. I'm Amara Walker. There's major breaking news in Syria as we are coming to air this morning. A lightning-fast rebel offensive ending 50 years of authoritarian rule in Syria.
Very good. Young, attractive guy, tough guy. Strong pants. Very strong pants fighter. I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
شهدت محافظة السويداء أحداثاً أليمة لم تترك أثرها في السويداء وحدها بل في قلب كل بيت سوري.
2025 was the first year out of 14 that the country awoke in peacetime. But while violence has decreased, roads have reopened, and over 1 million Syrians have returned home, millions more remain displaced, and others return to towns buried in rubble that some estimates say could take a decade just to clear. Our first expert today is special correspondent for Sky News, Alex Crawford, who reported from Syria across several years of Assad's rule and most recently went back to report this summer. Alex, welcome to MEE Live. It's great to have you. In terms of the day-to-day reality for the average person, how dramatically has life in Syria changed this year compared to the years of Assad's rule?
I think undoubtedly millions of Syrians welcomed the fall of Bashar al-Assad. Equally so, I think there were large sections of the population who were worried about what this new regime would bring and were deeply suspicious. And those doubters, primarily in the northeast of the country and in the south, the ethnic minorities, primarily Alawites, Druze, and the Kurds, still remain very worried about what the future will bring. But it's brought, a whole load of new freedoms for Syrians, many of whom have grown up not knowing any of those freedoms. I think the economic hardships haven't yet lifted. They're still suffering quite a lot. I know, for instance, my own producer, who I've known for 15 years or so, and became a refugee in Turkey, in neighbouring Turkey, where I live, has not felt able to take his family back. His children have grown up in Turkey, and he's still sending, for instance, one of his children to university in Turkey because he's not sure about the stability in the country. And I think that's the case for many people. He, on the other hand, is building a new house. So he's a lot more optimistic about the future. But I think on the ground, a lot of Syrians are still feeling quite a great deal of hardship, and they're worried about whether this new regime is going to follow through on a lot of its promises.
Now, it's an interim government, but it says it will be in power for 4 years before holding elections. Looking to 2026, what are the biggest challenges that face this government?
I mean, he's got a lot of challenges, al-Shara. He's got a huge amount of challenges. And actually, if you look back over the year, you could say, for a man who little over a year ago was in combat fatigues, leading an extremist Islamist militant organization who had a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head, he has come a long, long way. And he has managed to balance a lot of very strong, aggressive neighbors and as well as cultivate the two big powers in the world, the US and Russia, as well as at least give the impression that he's willing to talk and do a deal for the future with Israel, which would have been absolutely unconscionable, say 14 months ago even.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned this sort of transformation of Shara personally from a jihadist revolutionary leader to a state president and sort of diplomatic success story. We've seen him really rebrand from his initial days in power when there was a lot of global concern about his former hardline Islamist identities. Will religious minorities be okay? How will women fare in the new Syria? We've seen him shave his beard and change his name. Do you think that people are convinced by the rebranding we've seen over the past year?
I don't know. I interviewed him during the earthquake. If you remember, the big earthquake between Turkey that was hit Turkey and Syria. And I spoke to him then, having tried to interview him many years beforehand, and was told by a number of his loyal and most staunchest supporters that he would not be interviewed by a woman. I interviewed him during the earthquake, he knew we were there, so he knew he was going to be facing a female reporter. But at that stage, he had a lot of very extreme elements as his supporters and his loyalists. I was required and handed, a hijab to wear. I was told what to do and how to behave. And since then, he has gone out of his way to ditch the combat fatigues, to hold a hand out, if you like, metaphorically, to female journalists, female politicians. Does that translate to anything really different on the ground? It hasn't done yet. And certainly when I was in the country, for instance, in July, when there was a huge amount of violent bloodletting, absolute anarchy for days on end, a siege against the Druze minority in the south of the country, there were definite extremist elements still at play. And that is one of his huge challenges. So he's got twin challenges. He's got to somehow bring some sort of economic stability and ease life for fellow Syrians. He has said he wants to keep a unified Syria, and that is a massive challenge because he's got the Kurds in the northeast who have a very developed, very, very sophisticated military machine and civic administration up there who are, although they've signed deals with him, they're still very doubtful about whether it's all going to work. And of course, they are in charge of 50,000 ISIS fighters and tens of thousands of ISIS families, some of them foreign ISIS families. So there's a lot of uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And I think al-Shara is really, really trying to play all sides at the moment. And sooner or later, he's going to have to take tough decisions. And a lot of people on the ground are still seeing a mark of the old regime in the way it's running. The tenders are not transparent. Contracts are being given to fellow, there's a sort of a level of nepotism involved. They don't feel secure with the military. A lot of the weapons and the support for the regime is provided by Turkey. There's a large element in the country who do not trust Turkey. Yeah. So there's a huge amount at play here. And the fact that he's got this far, some would say is a minor miracle, because he has definitely got extremist elements among his closest, most loyal supporters, and trying to balance what they see and where they see the country going against other elements, particularly the ethnic minorities, and trying to keep everyone happy and feeling secure is an absolute minefield. Yeah.
And finally, just looking outward, you've touched on the diplomatic successes that Shara has had. Trump has been singing Syria's praises, but there are also immense external threats Syria faces, not least at the moment from Israel, who occupies its south. Could Israeli aggression towards Syria destabilize Syria's new government, or will its new friends like Donald Trump protect it?
I think there's a very high risk factor that Israel could destabilize the whole thing, not just Israel. Iran has seen its routes through to supply weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon and other militias in the area disrupted by this regime, which has, inadvertently given an advantage to Israel. But they're working to also try and re-establish those routes because they've been severely depleted as a result of this regime. Israel, though, is, it seems to me, having been on the ground, not just in Syria, but in Lebanon, Israel is, or the Israeli government is definitely working towards creating a tough buffer zone, not just between Syria, but also in Lebanon. And it's doing that by claiming territory. Most recently, as recently as November, it had troops on the ground in Syria shooting and trying to arrest villagers who, for the first time, shot back. And a number of, I think, half a dozen IDF soldiers were injured. I mean, that was quite a dramatic development with the potential to have really sparked off into something. And you can see that happening on a much bigger, much more frequent scale in the future. There is territory that al-Shara wants to reclaim, like the Golan Heights. Israel wants to stay and maintain a presence on Mount Hermon, as well as the south. There are Druze groups in the south, not all the Druze groups. One particular leader, Hikmat Hijari, who's called on Israel to protect them and wants to be semi-autonomous or autonomous. All of that is not going to be palatable to an al-Shara-run regime when he said he wants a unified country, and that means bringing in the Kurds in the north and their military might and not having a semi-autonomous or any separation down in the south.
Alex Crawford, it's been an absolute privilege to have you here on Middle East Eye Live. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Matilda.
Trump took office this year with a host of grand ambitions for the Middle East, but several of those plans for peace are yet to get off the ground.
Starting tomorrow, I will act with historic speed and strength and fix every single crisis facing our country. I don't want to be cute, I don't want to be a wise guy, but the Riviera of the Middle East, this could be something that could be so bad, this could be so magnificent. Tonight I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. Do you understand that?
Cracks appear to be emerging among the right in what has historically been unwavering support for Israel. On Monday, MAGA stronghold Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene ramping up her criticism.
A ceasefire in Gaza is expected to begin shortly in the next few hours.
The war is over, okay? You understand that? This is the historic dawn of a new Middle East.
Here to discuss U.S. policy in the region over the past year and ask what might come next is former Middle East advisor to the Pentagon and foreign policy analyst Jasmine el-Gamal. Hi, Jasmine. How are you? It's a pleasure to have you on.
Hi, good to see you. Thank you so much.
So, Jasmine, I'd like to start our discussion on Trump's policy by asking about his ceasefire plan in Gaza. So, after a very celebratory start, the Strip remains divided, and it seems that without a clear path forward, Hamas is unwilling to disarm. Few countries want to join an international stabilization force to disarm it, and so reconstruction has stalled. Do you think Trump is capable of moving the ceasefire to the next phase, and what would that require? What's in his way at the moment?
Right. Well, look, I mean, the ceasefire obviously when it was announced was a really positive move forward and has made some headway in stopping some of the most egregious bombing campaigns and sort of indiscriminate strikes that we had seen, and so has turned down the temperature in some ways. but it has increasingly shown to become a bit of a one-sided ceasefire, if you will. If you look at what's happening in Gaza right now, I mean, people are still dying, whether that's because of being struck by Israeli forces, including a case where 2 children were killed by Israeli forces because they allegedly crossed the yellow line that Israel has put in place to divide between the territory that they control and the territory that Hamas controls, or if simply because of very preventable factors like freezing to death. There was a headline today that talked about 13 people having died because of the recent storm that has passed through Gaza because the Israeli government hasn't let supplies and tents and shelter and medical aid in. So in terms of the act of the ceasefire, I would not give that very high marks as a simple tactical move because it simply hasn't stopped the fighting and it hasn't stopped the suffering. When you look at it from a grand scale and you zoom out, you still have a lot of questions that haven't been answered about the way forward. What is the mandate for these international security forces? How are countries going to send forces in? What operating procedures do they have? What rules, what restrictions? So many questions that still haven't been answered about the way forward.
It seems to me that a lot of that stalling is a product of the kind of tension between Trump's desire to declare these deals, to have these big agreements signed, but an unwillingness on the part of Israel to really let go of the military impunity or dominance it's come to exercise over the past 2 years. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
I mean, I would say that's certainly a factor. Look, I think that President Trump is very good at grand gestures and signing things and making statements, but doesn't really get to the heart of the issues that he says he's trying to solve. He doesn't get to the core issues, the root causes. He doesn't, I think, quite fully understand Prime Minister Netanyahu's ambitions, his domestic concerns, the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu needs war to survive politically. There are a lot of factors that President Trump and his team haven't taken into account simply because other than Jared Kushner, who's not an official member of the team, and perhaps Marco Rubio, the main person who's been involved in the ceasefire negotiations is Steve Witkoff, who may be a deal maker business-wise, in a business sense, but doesn't have that diplomatic background and foundation and that deep historical knowledge and context of these issues in order to be able to get to the root cause of some of them. And when you were talking about Hamas's disarmament, look, at the end of the day, in order to get to peace, if that's really what's on the table, Hamas as a non-state actor will have to disarm to a Palestinian force. But that's not going to happen up front, right? That is going to have to be part of a process. And you're going to have to see reciprocal moves on the Israeli side as well, because Palestinians, rightly so, are going to have to feel just as safe as Israelis will have to feel if we are really looking at a peaceful pathway forward.
Another area where Trump has been struggling to conclude a security agreement with real flesh to it is in Syria. And it seems similarly there, Israel has been continually conducting strikes on Syria. And despite Trump's efforts, they haven't agreed to stop them. How do you see those tensions I mentioned between Trump and Netanyahu's differing visions of what must happen playing out in the country?
Syria is an interesting case because I think this is one country in the Middle East that has really captured Donald Trump's attention personally. He tends to view the region through personal relationships, and it's obvious that he's built a very amicable personal relationship with Ahmed al-Shara and thinks highly of him. And so his view towards Syria is that he wants to help it succeed. He wants to help this government succeed. He wants to help them succeed economically. He wants to help them succeed in the security realm, as you've seen with the cooperation between U.S. forces and Syrian forces on counterterrorism issues. 2 U.S. soldiers and an interpreter were just killed in one of those operations in Syria a few days ago. And so this is one of, and to the extent that you believe press reports, this is one of those areas that is causing tension between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Donald Trump, because President Trump does not see what Israel is doing in Syria as constructive. He doesn't see it as helpful to his own goals. And of course, you know that this all comes back to a declaration of victory that Donald Trump wants to declare. Peace in the Middle East is something that he has been striving for because no one else has been able to do it. And he wants to be able to say he's done something that no one has done before and be rewarded for it. But regardless of why he's pushing for these peace deals, I just come back to the point that as long as the president continues to look at the region and peace efforts from this very superficial standpoint, which is stop the fighting, stop the big guns, sign a piece of paper, you're going to see, because you were asking me about what comes next, I see a lot of potential flashpoints in the coming year because a lot of those core issues that I was talking about have not actually been addressed in any of those peace deals. Syria is going to be dealing with, I think, a lot of challenges in the next year with the relationships with the Kurds, folding in the SDF to the National Syrian Military, ISIS and counterterrorism, the ISIS camps in the north, Israel's actions in the south, internal discord and internal sort of trauma that still has not been addressed by the Syrian government. They've made some strides, but certainly there's a lot more to be done. We're looking at Lebanon also, where the ceasefire has been violated continuously since it's been signed. And the U.S. is pressuring with Israeli backing, and pressure is pressuring the Lebanese government to disarm Hezbollah before it's probably ready to, and without having the proper resourcing. So still a lot ahead that could go wrong.
Jasmine, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live today. It was a pleasure to hear your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now to Palestine. 2025 may be the year of ceasefires in Israel's war on Gaza, but it was also the bloodiest year, as recorded fatalities doubled after the genocide's first anniversary.
Long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas.
It is a famine. The Gaza famine. Yet food stacks up at borders because of systematic obstruction by Israel.
Activists on board a flotilla of boats trying to deliver aid to Gaza say they've been intercepted by Israeli warships as they were approaching the territory.
Under international law, states have a legal obligation to act to prevent and to stop a genocide from happening.
A ceasefire in Gaza is expected to begin shortly in the next few hours once Israel's cabinet has formally approved the ceasefire agreement.
The war is over, okay? You understand that?
This year has certainly ended in a different phase of warfare to which it began. October brought both a US brokered ceasefire and what UNRWA called the deadliest month for settler violence in the West Bank. The global Palestine movement gathered incredible steam, from the weekly protests to the freedom flotillas to the strikes that shut down Italian ports. What Israel gained in military conquests, it lost in the reputational war. But this activism was also met by unprecedented repression around the world. Here to reflect on the year for Palestine, Israel, and the world that's been closely watching it is Palestinian-American author Susan Abulhawa. Welcome, Susan, to MEE Live. We started this year with one ceasefire. It didn't go very well. We end it with another. Trump says this one will bring everlasting peace. What do you think? Is this ceasefire any different to the last one?
Well, I think the answer is in your question, actually. The reason we had to have a second ceasefire in the first place is because Israel refused to honor the terms of the first one. Their violations and their non-compliance, even after the resistance met all of their obligations, were systematic. Israel failed to release the agreed upon ratio of prisoners. and the categories of Palestinian hostages. And they almost immediately resumed bombing and obstruction of humanitarian aid and supplies into Gaza, and maintained the siege conditions as they were. And more importantly, the Israeli leadership publicly reiterated their strategic goals of maintaining a long-term military presence in Gaza, which are fundamentally incompatible with a ceasefire. So this basically established a pattern where these ceasefire agreements were used just merely as tactical pauses so they could regroup, get their prisoners back, and without really giving anything in return that they couldn't immediately take back, including the Palestinian hostages that they released, and eventually many of them were rounded up again. So this ceasefire, I believe, is no different. The resistance has met their obligations vis-a-vis returning the Israeli military prisoners, whom the world insists on calling hostages, even though they're all military personnel. Israel has yet to comply with the bare minimum of allowing sufficient food and supplies into Gaza. And especially now, and you touched on this, is the lack of even adequate shelter structures that are lined up on the border that can't get into Gaza during winter, with horrific consequences that we're all witnessing, people having to endure.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the scenes from Gaza now are catastrophic in a wholly different way. So perhaps not an optimistic reading in terms of the ceasefire progress. Something I have seen up close while reporting for Middle East Eye on the global Sumud flotilla is that the global anti-genocide movement, pro-Palestine movement, has reached extraordinary levels of visibility, reach, coordination. Has it made a difference? Was 2025 the year that Palestine solidarity actually changed the game for Gaza?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this emergent, the global solidarity, which I frankly would rephrase as a global awakening, is unprecedented, but only in its scope and intensity. There was another moment in history when popular support for Palestine began to emerge on a global scale. And that was in the 80s and the early 90s after the first Intifada. So like today, for the first time since the establishment of the Jewish colony in Palestine, world opinion started turning against them because the masses could not reconcile the images of boys facing armored tanks and soldiers literally breaking the bones of Palestinian men, women, and children as a matter of state policy. So Israel employed a well-oiled tactic of empire, which was to channel the moral energy of the street into the closed rooms of negotiations and diplomacy, similar to what we're doing today. So that's how the Oslo Accords basically diffused that moment of popular indigenous power that became global. And like I said, they're trying to do the same thing now with this so-called ceasefire. Israel has not been able to achieve its primary goal of exterminating or ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Gaza in order to take over the entire strip of land and all of its valuable resources, namely gas, offshore gas. They've not been able to do this but through force. So they are resorting to the same trickery of trying to diffuse popular global solidarity by channeling the energy of the street into the closed diplomacy, negotiations, ceasefire, etc., that they can control, and none of which they have any intention of honoring, as we can see through the unfolding reality, and as we can see also in what history has taught us with them.
Now, something else that has come from this sort of anti-genocide movement that has mobilized over what's been happening in Gaza, and with the ceasefire that's come in since October, is attention has shifted or perhaps expanded to include the genocide in Sudan and the civil war and humanitarian crisis in Sudan. However, that is not a new crisis, and for a long time it's been called the forgotten war. I wonder if 2025 is the year that the world started paying attention to Sudan. And how do you think that what's happening now in Sudan relates to that movement that is built up around Gaza?
No doubt, what's happening in Sudan is horrific, and in many ways, the horrors there are a continuation of the genocide in Palestine. It's part of the model of Zionist criminality and impunity. We all know the pivotal role that is being played by the United Arab Emirates in fomenting the chaos and bloodshed in Sudan. And the UAE is basically another Zionist entity in the region, frankly. However, they do not act of their own accord. The UAE really has no real sovereignty, and it does not act without American and Israeli blessings and backing. So it's not just Sudan. We can extend this logic to Congo as well and elsewhere. President Gustave Petro said it well, that what Israel is doing in Gaza is basically an experiment of empire, which will be implemented around the world if it's allowed to succeed. And I think that's what we're seeing in Sudan. And frankly, ultimately, Palestine is the center of resistance. It is the moral center of this generation, and the liberation of Palestine will be the liberation of Sudan. It will be the liberation of Congo. Israel must fall and take with it their supremacist ideology and their violent expansionism and extraction.
And just as we've seen the rising momentum of this movement that you've been describing, arguably we've also seen an equal and opposite reaction, an incredible amount of repression from governments against the pro-Palestine and anti-genocide movements around the world. Here in UK, we've had thousands of people arrested for holding signs saying, "I oppose genocide." That's in the wake of the terrorist prescription of the group Palestine Action. You yourself accused the Oxford Union of censoring you last year when it deleted the full video of your successful debate that Israel was an apartheid state. 2025, then, do you feel like has been a year a step forwards or a step backwards for free speech on this topic?
So the genocide in Gaza has been revealing in so many ways, because it has pulled back all the masks on all fronts. And one of the most obvious ways it has been showing, the idea of free speech really to be a big sham. In the West. Gaza has shown the world that the so-called, Western values that the West likes to beat the rest of the world over the head with aren't real. In fact, all of that, the free speech and Western values seem to end when power faces a minimal challenge, as we've seen. We've witnessed sweeping, coordinated crackdowns, violent dismantling of peaceful student encampments at major universities across the US and across Europe, the doxing, the harassment and firing of academics, students, artists, healthcare workers for just simply expressing pro-Palestinian views. It's mind-blowing, really. And the arrest of citizens for social media posts, targeting of journalists, people like Medhurst and Sarah Wilkinson and others who've been arrested for being journalists. And of course, the assassination of journalists in Gaza. So the mechanism is clear. Smear campaigns that label criticism as anti-Semitism, that lead to deplatforming, blacklisting, and all manner of repression that are designed to punish anyone who does not go along with the Israeli narrative. And one of the most potent examples is what you mentioned. It was the proscribing of Pal Action, a legitimate nonviolent political direct action group whose members are currently languishing in British prisons on a hunger strike, and as I understand, many of them on the brink of death now. And for what? To protect a genocidal settler colony? I mean, this isn't about safety. It's about silencing dissent in order to maintain a singular pro-Israeli narrative. And people really are starting to ask now why their fundamental democratic values are being suppressed to appease Israel.
Susan,
why are their governments willing to dismantle international law and a world order that they frankly created and cultivated for decades?
Susan, thank you. I'm gonna stop you there, but thank you so much, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. And next, we turn to the region of Iran.
One of the most astonishing events in the Middle East this year has been Israel's 12-day war with Iran in June. Both Iran and its allies across the region have suffered heavy losses in the past 2 years. Yet at the moment, their future remains uncertain.
We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear enrichment program. We struck at the heart of Iran's nuclear weaponization program.
Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
The extent to which Israel's strikes in June actually damaged Iran's nuclear capacity are still being debated, and its allies across the region, such as Hezbollah, still refuse to disarm. So what is the future for Iran and its allied groups across the region? Here to answer that question is Dr Mahjoob Zweiri, a professor in contemporary history and the politics of the Middle East at Qatar University and director of the Gulf Studies Center. Dr Zweiri, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
So I just want to ask firstly about where Iran's leadership is right now. Israel's strikes on the country not only affected its military capacity, but part of its ideological raison d'etre. How is Iran recalibrating its strategy in the wake of those losses?
Thank you for having me. Let me just correct something. I'm no longer part of Qatar University. So I'm just independent scholar in the same area. Look, when we talk about Iran in 2025, there are three things we have to look at them and to see how the future of Iran will be in the light of three events. Number one, Iran has lost its image in 25 officially in the region. Its regional influence has been completely in the region, and there's no longer a way to go back to build or rebuild that influence in the region. That itself a great loss to Iran. Number two, the continuation of the conflict with Israel is likely to continue. As long as Netanyahu in power in Israel, Iran will be a potential target to Israel. I do believe that Israel, maybe in collaboration with the United States, will have in 2026 sort of attack, targeting Iran in different ways. I see that the potential is to see Iran like Iraq in 1990s, where basically weaken the institutions, weaken the image of the regime, and leave it for a few years until change comes. Number three, the whole investment of Iran in the nuclear issue, on the regional politics, had to reach the point that Iran has lost all of this investments. Not only that, Iran now is going back to open all of those notes and say, look, Syria has to pay us $100 million. Iraq has to pay us back this amount of money. And we have done all of this in the region because the others wanted us to play that role. We saw this in a statement by the president of Iran, Pezeshkian. We saw this in the statement of the former Foreign Minister Zarif and then other officials. And that is a strong indication that Iran is living in an internal debate about what went wrong until we get to this point, which make us believe that there is ongoing, I would say, not only debate, but also sort of a critique and the criticism to different groups to each other that you are responsible, and all of this going on.
Yeah, one of the biggest critiques in terms of internally in Iran is that, look, over the past few years, you've spent all your money on regional strategic ambitions. At home, we didn't prepare ourselves enough. One of the places where Iran is accused of really overextending itself is not only in Syria, but also in Lebanon through the Lebanese group Hezbollah. And kind of deepening Iran's isolation, Hezbollah has come under real diplomatic pressure from the US and military pressure from Israel to lay down its arms. Just yesterday, we saw Syria intercepted another alleged weapons shipment to Hezbollah. How do you see this playing out in Lebanon, given the deadline is fast approaching for Hezbollah disarmament? And I'm sure the group remembers very well that in its recent war with Israel, Iran did not come to its aid.
What is clear to me, based on information, that Iran is not ready to engage on what is happening in Lebanon now. In the last visit by Larijani to Lebanon, he met senior leaders of Hezbollah, and according to someone who's close, he reported that Ali Larijani was asked that what Iran's position will be in case there is a confrontation between Hezbollah and the government. The message was debate, having a discussion is a better choice. I think the message was clear that Iran will not be support of any kind of confrontation in Lebanon, because basically in the light of what's happening in Syria and the lack of any base to Iran in the region, it will be difficult to provide any kind of support to Lebanon. More important is actually the image of Iran itself has been affected badly. So there is lack of a trust of Iran and what Iran is doing. I think there is, even within Lebanese politics or Lebanese Hezbollah's leadership, that what Iran did to us in the last 2 years, where Iran from all of that. And I think that's also has made Iran more hesitant to play any kind of role at the current I would say situation.
Iran's support for groups across the region was not just a source of tension with the US and Israel, but also with the Gulf states in areas like Yemen.
Yes.
I wonder, now that Iran has been so clearly weakened and is taking this reduced role, how has that changed the security calculations in the Gulf? We've seen this kind of tepid rapprochement process. How are the Gulf states looking at Iran and the future of their relationship?
I think Gulf states, all of them, they are not, I would say, pushing to any kind of confrontation, military confrontation. That was the status quo previously. They tried, even Saudi Arabia, they tried to push back any kind of confrontation because they know that it will have a consequence on all regional players. However, I think some of the countries, they look at what's happening in a positive manner, that, okay, Iran is weakened. we should benefit from that. We should talk to Iran. We should not disconnect, I would say, any kind of communication with Iran. And that is what's happening. Actually, the meeting between China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, following up to this kind of Chinese mediation between the both countries, continued. And just last month, there was a meeting between the three countries following up on that meeting. So basically, I think they're happy. Some of them, they are happy with what they are seeing Iran, but they don't want this kind of status quo to go to a more confrontational status. They don't want to see this. They want Iran to rethink about the status quo and to consider other options and play a positive role. I think that is the current status quo. Of course, the attack on Qatar has a great, I would say, role or impact on how Iran is perceived as well from the closest friends like Qatar and Oman, and there was a great implication on potential mediation between the United States and Iran, because the two countries, they say, okay, Qatar is a close friend. You have done this. You attack al-Udeid, and how can I trust you as a friend? So both countries seem to step back and say, okay, we may not ready to have any kind of mediation role, and I think that is the reason why we see there is no mediation regional mediation when it comes to the nuclear issue between the United States and Iran, and that is another loss to Iran politically.
Yeah, Iran's credibility, its stature in the region, certainly heavily damaged after the past 2 years. Whether that's recoverable remains to be seen. Dr. Zweiri, thank you so much for speaking to MEE Live today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, guys. My pleasure to be.
Pleasure
thank you so much.
To have
thank
you on.
Appreciate it.
And next, to zoom out and take a larger look at the region and just how impactful this past year has been historically, we'll be speaking to Dr. Roy Casagranda.
Yes, that was 2025. You heard it here. But how does it fit into the long arc of Middle Eastern history? Will this be a year to remember or a year to forget? Our final guest for this special year finale is the historian and political scientist, Dr. Roy Casagranda. Dr. Roy Casagranda, welcome to MEE Live. Now, this year, you spoke publicly about what you called the Middle East's new war of attrition. The old war of attrition refers to the sort of drawn-out conflict between Egypt and Israel in the wake of the 1967 Six-Day War. Could you just explain quickly what is meant by a war of attrition and why you think we're seeing a new one fought today?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the situation in the Middle East is that it's unique from the rest of the world. There's the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Libya is a fragile system, right? It's got two governments that both claim legitimacy. Sudan's in civil war, Yemen's in civil war. Syria is maybe recovering from civil war, but there's still a little bit of violence. Iraq is recovering from the United States blowing it up. Lebanon is getting back on its feet after catastrophic inflation and economic degradation. Like on multiple fronts, Somalia is still in civil war. On multiple fronts, the region is suffering from these really, really brutal wars. At some level, they're intractable. Like, it's hard to imagine how we see an end to the fighting in Yemen, at least in the near future. It doesn't look like the Sudan is going to be resolved anytime soon as well. So, and then of course, the UN from the very beginning, 1948, gave up on the Palestinians and decided they were going to have permanent refugee status for all eternity. One of the interesting things, though, is in the Civil War cases, there's no reason for either side to run out, right? There's no reason for them to burn out. They can just fight until the last person is standing. But in the case of Israel-Palestine, the Israelis will eventually run out of economic ability. They can't do this indefinitely. The only thing keeping them afloat right now is the United States, the UK, and Germany. If the United States, the UK, and Germany were to end funding or even lower funding, Israel would be forced to the negotiation tables. So at this point, the question is, can their morale hold up? So that's the one place where attrition could resolve the conflict in the near or short term.
And speaking of Israel, I'm curious how this year, in your eyes, has shifted its relations with its neighbours. Trump came in saying the primary agenda was to push normalization. This has, of course, been a very, very long, unfinished story. Is Israel closer to normalization with its neighbours today, or is it closer to a war on all fronts?
I mean, Israel has been in a war on all fronts since its creation, right? It's doing the same thing South Africa did during the South Africa's border war period, where South Africa was fighting in Namibia and Angola and Zambia and Zimbabwe, and they were all fighting back. So we have a very similar situation with Israel. They're constantly bombing Lebanon. They're constantly bombing Syria. They're actually in Syria right now, not just the Golan Heights, but they've actually crossed into Syria, past the Golan Heights. So Israel is that country that's permanently in a state of war with its neighbors. I guess the question is how it relates to the Gulf states, how it relates to Egypt, how it relates to Turkey. And the answer is that it's in serious trouble. It's crossed multiple lines, including bombing Qatar. And I think that the Middle East is sort of reassessing whether or not a reasonable peace deal is possible with Israel.
I wonder, that was a really interesting point comparing it to South Africa historically. I wonder how you would compare it to Israel's own history. As we look back, Israel had another stunning victory in the past in 1967 following the Six-Day War. But that victory also marked an increasingly rightward shift in Israel, and also the advent of a new form of kind of non-state resistance across the region, mainly by groups subscribing to political Islam rather than kind of Nasser's pan-Arabism. Do you see 2025 as another iteration of this kind of transition period where Israel has scored huge tactical gains, but strategically there could be the advent of a new wave of opposition to its actions in the region?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So there's so many layers to it. On the one hand, yeah, they their victories against Hezbollah they were shocking. The fact that the Syrian government collapse may not actually be a victory for them in the long run, but in the short run, I think they definitely viewed it as that. And from a military standpoint, there's nothing the Palestinians can do. So the Gaza, this Gaza massacre, because there have been so many Gaza massacres, this particular run has been excruciating and brutal and on a scale that we've never seen the Israelis operate at before. This looks like what Nazi Germany did to Poland. So in many ways, the Gaza Strip has become like the Warsaw Ghetto, and what happens in a situation like that is it pushes people to radicalism. So it didn't hurt Hamas, it empowered Hamas, because now people are going to be even more determined to fight. When people have nothing to fight for, right, because their homes are destroyed, their family is dead, their business is ruined, their jobs are gone, the tendency is for people to then go to these extremes. And of course, that's part of Israel's goal. It's easy to portray Hamas as evil. It's easy to portray Hamas as the bad guy. And one of the things Israel and the United States, for that matter, has done is they've targeted the socialists, they've targeted the secularists, they've targeted the moderates, they've killed them or put them in prison, so that the radical wing of Palestinian resistance would be all that was left, or in the case of the PLA, just converted into the capo that runs the concentration camp, as opposed to the resistance that's pushing back for its own people's liberation.
Roy, you point out that everything happening today is just a historical event still unfolding. If we look at the key news events of 2025 across the region, I'm curious what you think the main historical events are in the driving seat today. You know, is it colonialism, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, Arab Spring? When you look at what has unfolded in the Middle East this year, what would you say are the dominant historical issues in the driving seat?
Do you mean like what connects to the past to make this moment happen?
Yeah.
Is that...
I suppose at different times, as a journalist, you would see key historical events as sort of the axis through which modern events are being looked at through. And for ages, the revolution in Iran would have been one, and that feels like it's shifting today. But you're the historian, and I would love to get your view on where 2025, what the stories continuing through 2025 are from a historical perspective.
Yeah, I mean, the Iranian Revolution will always have a massive impact on the Middle East, if for no other reason because it inspired the extremists and the fundamentalists who thought, oh, let's do that here in our country. And then, of course, it gave the United States this pariah in the region to, turn into the boogeyman and constantly villainize. It completely reshaped the way the Middle East works, including getting the United States to push Iraq to attack Iran and do the horrible Iran-Iraq war. And then, ironically enough, the United States turns on Iraq in the end and blows it up twice. And of course, taking Iraq down like that completely redid the power structure in the Middle East because Iraq was one of the regional powers. And of course, now it's a basket case. And so, so that through line definitely still matters. The 1967 war is obviously still playing a major role because that's when the Israelis captured the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And it was really interesting because it was in a way it was a catastrophe and an undoing of Israeli policy. So from the beginning, the Israelis had a goal in 1948 that they tried to implement in 1948. And that goal was to make it so that Israel was 80% Jewish, 20% Arab. They didn't want it 0% Arab because they needed the cheap labor, right? They would render the Arabs into basically a serf class and then have them, build walls and buildings and think of what Germany tried to do to Poland in World War II. So that was the goal. And then what happened was when they captured, they never really got there. It was 75-25. It's still 75-25 in Israel proper. But when in 1967, they suddenly ended up with the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. When you add the 2 million Palestinians in Israel plus, the almost 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and then the 1.5 to 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, suddenly you realize there's actually more Palestinians than there are Israelis in between Israel and the occupied territories. And so they actually, by winning, have messed up their whole plan and don't know what to do. They've grabbed the tiger by the tail, and they've realized now, oh my God, we're like apartheid South Africa. We're the minority white population ruling over a brown population. How do we make this work? And their answer is to basically leave the Palestinians in a permanent state of statelessness.
And you say the answer is, but what that points to is that, what was happening then in a lot of ways does bear resemblance to what's happening now. And I hate to cut you off, Dr. Roy Casagranda, as always, it's been a real pleasure having you on MEE Live. Thank you for helping us put 2025 into the bigger picture. Now for today, that is all that we have time for. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you.
Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social media platform or email meelive@middleeasteye.net.
We will be here back in 2026 at 5 p.m. GMT, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday.
We'll see you in the new year, but for now, enjoy your holidays.